as well as nationally. We have to systematize after-action processes for exercises and real-world events. I think part of the process needs to include independent assessments. We need to have independent folks analyze our national preparedness, which is what our exercises are. Organizations need, like the auditing for financial controls under Sarbanes-Oxley, independent assessments of our IT infrastructure so folks can get the objective report, because we cannot in this world rely on the people that are doing things to be the ones who evaluate how well they're doing them. That, I think we've proven, and we need to learn that lesson. I think the risk management program can facilitate and prioritize planning, decision-making, and resource allocation. I mean, the beauty of risk management, and although I heard last week somebody say that, you know, risk management programs designed to get rid of all risk, I think those of people who deal in the real world realize that that's not even a stated goal of it. I mean, we are really talking about managing risk and prioritizing resources and having greater clarity as to what we're going to do and when we're going to do it, and the roadmap down the line for it. The strategic approach should be grounded in architectural design and process principles, and as I said, I believe the stakeholders need to be engaged in the assessment and mitigation of risk, spending on research and development, incident response, and recovery preparedness. We have a complex infrastructure that we're trying to be concerned about. We're trying to promote the functioning of this infrastructure, not just basic functionality, but the core functionality is what we're trying to preserve. We have an interesting dynamic now, and you know, folks may have some comments now or later about the relationship between the public and private sector and what we're seeing. The Hill folks yesterday, and I think in the legislation that Senator Lieberman will introduce in the next week or two, I think the White House, on the anniversary of President Obama's May speech on cyber, will probably announce the administration's legislative recommendations. So we've got a tremendous tension on some of those issues, but we have the regulated groups with Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, the chemical industry, the nuclear industry, and there's increasing pressure to raise the bar in each of these communities. And the private sector is pushing back, encouraging the use of incentives and rewards and best practices as a way to shape the landscape. So Congress doesn't think the private sector has done enough and tried hard enough. And there certainly has been an awful lot of activity in the private sector, but you see in the example of one of the major issues that the private sector has pushed is let's use incentives instead of regulation. And one of the things that frustrates me is that, and I've seen numerous reports, and they really are great, bright people, like the Internet Security Alliance. I think with ANSI did a recent report, but ISA has been very strong for incentives. So they want things like, oh, they want tax breaks, they want insurance, they want to streamline regulations, they want safe harbor, they want things like that. But what never gets specific is, what is it that the private sector proposes to do? In other words, to raise the bar, what should the goal be? And what should be the intermediate steps? Because you can't expect people to achieve the goal, you know, in 1 year. So what is it you want folks to do? And what do you want to give them as an incentive to do it? And I was speaking with somebody who came up with the idea of a capital gains break for companies that are striving and achieving the right kinds of results. Which, although it's a good creative idea, as you know, the capital gains rate is across the board and based on what you buy and how long you hold it, but it's not. It doesn't have this kind of an indicator. But the congressional testimony, the reports, it's, oh, we want incentives. We don't want regulation. We want incentives. And part of the problem is that the private sector, they're critical of NIST, the NIST standards, because, well, that's U.S. government-centric, and that's government and doesn't really have private input. And well, it certainly does have a lot of private input. But so they're saying, oh, well, we should use international standards. But the company should get to choose what standard they're going to work toward. So they're going to choose what they're working toward, and then they'll get some kind of a break, like a tax credit or something else. But they don't want to say, let's use ISO 27001 or 2 or whatever. They don't want to say that because they're afraid if industry voluntarily says, this is what we should do, these are the best practices we should follow, even by sector, that the government will then mandate using that standard. So what happens is there's a lot of good talk and a lot of good meetings and an awful lot of reports, but there's not a specific focus on, okay, this is what we're going to do, and then you've got to have a discussion among private sector. Well, what's going to convince folks who don't believe it's worth it to spend the money to go to that point? So you see, for example, in the Rockefeller-Snow legislation, and I thought this proposal had been dropped after pressure from industry, but they want to mandate certain standards for critical infrastructure, and they want to mandate that there be audits every 6 months of those companies to see if they're in compliance with the standards. And I don't think the first time or two it would mean you'd pull the plug or it'd be, but I think it's a stair-step kind of thing. And obviously that's considered by most of the private sector as like really jumping way ahead and really becoming prescriptive rather than process-driven. It's expected that the executive branch is going to talk more about those who do business with the government. The Defense Acquisition Regulations, the DFAR, for example, are going to raise the bar. You want to do business with the government, you're going to have to meet some of these standards, like the NIST Standard 800-53, for example. And depending on what you do, it might be things like the DISA STIGs, that kind of thing. So leveraging the purchasing power of the federal government is going to be one of the major things in the next year that I would suggest is going to be a major change, and I think that's going to help raise the bar. Hopefully they do it in a constructive way. The utility, transportation, other critical infrastructure are under tremendous pressure. As you know, the power folks kind of wrote their own regulations, and then others came in and said, well, this is a joke, these really aren't worth anything. But you have a landscape where the profit margins of many, if not all those companies, is very, very tight. So the cost benefit and their desire to raise the bar isn't matched up with their ability to pay for it. So in terms of the public sector, trying to analyze, what are the most important things here? What do we need to do to raise the bar? Instead, what we're doing, for example, in the electric power area, and there is some good work being done on SCADA and control systems that's been continuing. They say, okay, well, let's make sure that we share with the power producers information on threat. That is certainly a piece of what needs to go into the equation of, in that area, what is critical, what do we have to be able to maintain, and what is the plan for doing that. I mentioned the private sector favors the standards, the incentives, and the safe harbor provisions. The private sector really likes things like the Safety Act that was passed a few years ago in terms of the terrorism insurance issue, where companies that were going to produce products to deal with terrorism were concerned that if they failed, that they would face a tremendous liability, and they were saying there was no market, they couldn't buy insurance. So the idea, which I think was a pretty good one, was that, okay, if the company does this, then they will be able to buy insurance to protect themselves. But what they want to do in the cybersecurity realm, and I don't know that it's a perfect fit, is and you see an example of it in the data breach legislation. All the states have data breach legislation. They're trying to create federal legislation. And so they're trying to create something in there to incentivize companies to do the right thing, but give them some reward if they do it, because you can't be perfect. You can't eliminate all risk. And so they want to put something in there that if a company does X, Y, and Z, and there's a breach nonetheless, they're not going to have to disclose it and lose the harm in the share price. So that kind of concept of trying to get companies to do the right thing, and they'll get some limitation of liability, some protection in terms of the cybersecurity realm, is of great interest to the private sector. And at least the people from the Hill who spoke yesterday feel like the train's already left the station, and that is not really of interest to them. They're much more focused on, well, first of all, they're focused on being able to say that they did something, and I think in an election year, that's certainly something that's very important, but something that's probably more regulatory than that. There's an increasing global recognition of the importance of national health and security. I want to talk about a couple examples, and I guess we can make the slide deck available later. Transglobal Secure Collaboration Program, the governments of the U.S., the U.K., and the Netherlands. The U.S. Defense Industrial Base Program is a very important program for defense and aerospace contractors run by the Department of Defense. Like the general defense acquisition regulations that I think are going to be revised to help raise the bar, this DIB process of these companies is going to get these companies to raise the bar, that if they are going to be part of the suppliers of the U.S. government, they've got to protect themselves. They have to be ready for these advanced, persistent, and other very sophisticated threats.